Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're embarking on a pretty fascinating, strictly objective historical investigation into one of the most famous figures in all of human history. It's honestly kind of wild to think that a peasant from the ancient world left such a massive footprint on our culture. So today, we're putting on our historian hats to see exactly what the surviving ancient texts actually tell us. It all starts with this one massive question. Did the historical Jesus actually exist? Well, let's dive right into this. For the purpose of this explainer, we're going to completely strip away the theology, the modern religious debates, and our own personal beliefs. Whether you're a devout believer, a strict skeptic, or anywhere in between, our mission today is just to strictly analyze the historical evidence. We really want to find out what modern scholars and historians can definitively prove about a first-century man from Nazareth. All right, here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the historical Jesus, the historian's toolkit, non-Christian evidence, biblical evidence, and finally, we'll wrap up with the scholarly consensus. Okay, section 1, the historical Jesus, separating the man from the myth. To really kick off our investigation, we actually have to split our subject into two very distinct profiles. On one side, you have the Christ of faith. This is the theological figure worshipped by millions around the world, the Son of God, the miracle worker, the resurrected Savior. But on the completely opposite side, we have the historical Jesus. This is the actual flesh and blood man that historians study. We're talking about a first-century Jewish peasant who lived the grinding, extremely precarious life of a rural laborer in Roman-occupied Palestine. When historians look at these ancient texts, they aren't looking for the theology. They're trying to piece together the life of this very real, everyday man. Moving on to section 2, the historian's toolkit, how we know what we know. When dealing with ancient history, scholars honestly act a lot like detectives, trying to corroborate an alibi. They rely heavily on a concept called multiple attestation. Basically, if a biblical passage claims Jesus did something, and then a completely independent, non-Christian Roman historian documents a very similar incident, well, scholars definitely take notice. By finding these corroborating details across entirely separate, independent documents, historians can effectively rule out later fabrications. Now, there is a super common misconception out there about the timeline of ancient evidence. Just for some context here, the earliest surviving biographies of Alexander the Great were written centuries after his death. Centuries! But with Jesus, the primary sources were written just decades after he died. I know it sounds surprising, but by ancient historical standards, this textual proximity is actually incredibly strong. Let's look at section 3, non-Christian evidence, neutral and hostile witnesses. So some of our absolute best evidence actually comes from people who actively disliked the early Christians. Take Flavius Josephus, for instance. He was a first-century Jewish historian writing around 93 CE, and he refers to Jesus as a wise man, and even mentions his brother, James. Then you have Tacitus, a Roman senator writing around 115 CE, who explicitly documents the execution of Christus by Pontius Pilate. And then there's Pliny the Younger around 112 CE, who detailed how early Christians were gathering to worship him. You see, these guys aren't Christian cheerleaders. These are independent and often quite hostile sources, verifying the foundational facts of his life and his brutal execution. And this brings up a really fascinating point. These Roman and Jewish historians had absolutely no theological reason whatsoever to promote Jesus. In fact, many of them completely despised the early Christian movement. And yet, they universally accepted his historical existence as a basic, undeniable fact. The idea that Jesus was entirely made up, that simply wasn't even a concept in the ancient world, not even among his absolute worst enemies. All right, section 4, biblical evidence, the New Testament as history. So how do historians actually handle the Christian sources? Well, they look at the chronological progression of the Gospels to extract historical probability. It's like a 3-step process. It all started with step 1, oral transmission. For decades right after his death, teachings were conserved entirely by word of mouth. Then, step 2 brings us to the synoptic Gospels. That's Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Mark was written first, and because these are the closest to the actual events, historians lean on them pretty heavily for the basic timeline of his public ministry. Finally, step 3 is the Gospel of John. This one was written much later, around 90 to 95 CE, and it represents a highly developed theology of the early church. So when Jesus makes those soaring claims about his divinity in John, scholars widely agree this reflects the later Christian community's beliefs rather than literal quotes spoken by a peasant in first-century Galilee. Finally, section 5, the scholarly consensus, what historians actually agree on. When you actually ask modern academics where they stand on all this, The answer is remarkably unified. As the prominent New Testament scholar Bart D. Ehrman states, he certainly existed, as virtually every competent scholar of antiquity, Christian or non-Christian, agrees. You might have heard of this popular internet theory called mythicism, the idea that Jesus was a complete invention. Well, it turns out that's actually a fringe theory. It's completely rejected by virtually all serious credentialed academics, regardless of what their own personal religious beliefs might be. So what does this bedrock academic consensus actually look like? Well, here are the undeniable, historically probable facts. Jesus was, for sure, a real historical person. He was a first-century Jewish peasant who grew up in Galilee. He was an itinerant preacher and teacher who gathered a following. Scholars almost universally agree that he was baptized by John the Baptist, and most certainly, he was executed by crucifixion under the orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. These points right here, they aren't about faith. This is the strict historical baseline. And when we piece all of this surviving evidence together, we can actually reconstruct a really cohesive, widely accepted timeline. He was born around 6 to 4 BCE, right near the end of King Herod's reign. Fast forward a bit to around 28 CE, he's baptized and begins his public ministry, teaching out in synagogues and rural areas. And then, around 30 CE, his life ends with a brutal Roman crucifixion by Pilate in Jerusalem. It is an incredibly short, intense timeline that literally sparked a movement that changed the entire world. Which leaves us with this final, somewhat provocative thought for you to chew on. How does uncovering the strictly historical evidence change your understanding of one of history's most influential figures? When we take the time to separate the history from the later theological developments, we find this remarkably compelling, complex first-century man whose actual life is firmly rooted in the ancient historical record. I really hope this explainer helped clarify exactly how historians uncover the past, and maybe even sparked your curiosity to learn more about how we understand our world. Thanks so much for learning with me today.